So the Las Vegas Raiders have made it official today, in which they have officially hired Pete Carroll. At the same time, John Spytek is another guy that we had heard was coming to the Las Vegas Raiders. But of course, with the entire Liam Cohen situation that kind of happened, some people were speculating that there's a chance Spytek might actually end up leaving the Raiders and head to the Jags with Liam Cohen. And that's not happening, obviously, right? So Pete Carroll and John Spytek are officially with the Las Vegas Raiders. There's no backing out. There's no, this guy's not going to be here even though he agreed to it. It is official as it gets. So today we're going to make that shift and talk a little bit about the coordinators, because I think, arguably, and I truly believe this, the Raiders will win as many games as these coordinators allow them to, especially with the way Pete Carroll has been known as the coach that he ultimately is, right? Pete Carroll's a defensive guy. He's called plays in the past, but generally speaking, he gives most of his responsibilities of play calling to the actual coordinators. And that's not always the case, right? Like, you look at some of the best teams right now. Andy Reid, you look at Kyle Shanahan, you look at Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur. These guys are calling plays. But there are some coaches that don't, and Pete Carroll's one of those guys. So Pete Carroll, for him, he has to hire good coordinators. And I want to talk about some of the guys and rumors specifically that we're kind of hearing right now. We'll go ahead and get right into it. We'll start with the offense side of the football. We'll get into the first guy. I think this is the guy that has a strong chance to actually be the coordinator. This is going to be Darrell Bevell, who has been with the Seattle Seahawks during the Pete Carroll days. He was a play caller for Pete Carroll. He was the play caller at the time that the Seahawks ultimately won the Super Bowl. So this guy has a ton of play calling experience. He's done it where he's able to have, them have success. He's done it at the highest level. And he's a good coordinator, right? Darrell Bevell has shown us that he can definitely get it done, especially when you consider the type of offense that the Seahawks ran during the early Pete Carroll days. It was mostly a defensive side of the football team. They were really conservative on the offensive side, and that kind of allowed them to have success. And I think with the Raiders, the fact that we don't really have a quarterback, we're going to kind of take that same approach. Plus, we have a lot of cap dollars spent on the defense side of the football. So I think similar to how the Seahawks were constructed in the early 2010s, I think the Raiders are going to take that same approach. So I think Darrell Bevell, who is the current favorite for the Raiders offensive coordinator position, could definitely make a lot of sense. Now, I'll be the first to tell you guys, he would not be my number one option for the Raiders. There's a couple other guys that I think could also be options for the Raiders. Some of these guys have been with Pete Carroll. Some others have not. We'll go ahead and just get into the three guys first and foremost. So Shane Waldron's a guy that I would not mind for the Las Vegas Raiders. Waldron was with the Seahawks with Pete Carroll in the final 3 years that Pete Carroll was the head coach, and Shane Waldron was calling plays. Shane Waldron gets credit for essentially turning around Geno Smith and getting this guy into the type of quarterback we've seen essentially over the last 3 years. And then this is the fourth year. But this year, Smith is obviously not with Waldron or Pete Carroll, or I should say this last year specifically. But Shane Waldron's a pretty good play caller in my opinion. Now, he did take the job as the offensive coordinator for the Bears, and he did get fired in the middle of the season. I don't think Shane Waldron was fired necessarily because he was a bad play caller. I think he was fired because Matt Eberflus, who was the head coach, knew that my time's coming to an end. I got to make some sort of change in the hopes that we can spark this team. And although they fired Shane Waldron, a couple weeks later, they fired Matt Eberflus as well. Truth be told, I think if they went the other route, where they actually fired Matt Eberflus first, I think they would have actually been better if they let Shane Waldron take over at that point. Now, that's my opinion. It will never be proven right, but it'll probably never be proven wrong either. I think some point Shane Waldron will get another job. And I even think, he might be a head coach candidate in a couple of years. We'll see what actually ends up happening. Shane Waldron, I think, is another guy who has experience with Pete Carroll. So he's another guy to kind of keep an eye on. None of these guys are guaranteed. Truth be told, Pete Carroll could pull some random guy out of college, right? We don't know, right? But these are some of the guys that, there is at least a possibility you can potentially bring these guys in, right? Another guy that I think has a ton of upside, two guys specifically, both guys are fired. I guess all three of these guys are fired, but Clint Kubiak is another guy that if I'm the Las Vegas Raiders, if I'm Pete Carroll, you got to consider it, man. Clint Kubiak has a ton of upside. He's a good play caller. And it's unfortunate for some of these guys because, the situations that they're ultimately in, you couldn't do much, right? All three of these guys, I'd make the argument. Shane Waldron went to a team with the rookie quarterback. That too, it's a rookie quarterback that cannot really play within structure. with Caleb Williams specifically, right? He struggles to play within structure, different than a guy like Jaden Daniels who can play really well within structure. And I think with a guy like Shane Waldron, he wasn't able to kind of make that happen. Similar with Clint Kubiak, he had a guy in Derek Carr who, they looked really good in the first 2 weeks, took a step back in weeks 3 and 4, and then Derek Carr is basically in and out for the rest of the season at that point, right? But Clint Kubiak showed a little bit of upside, right? Truth be told, those first 2 to 3 weeks, this guy was dropping like 30, 40 points a game, right? And to me, Clint Kubiak looked really, really good with the Saints. Unfortunately, he went to a situation where the head coach was on his last leg essentially, and when the head coach was let go, Clint Kubiak was not going to be retained essentially, right? So the New Orleans Saints, although they had that moment with Clint Kubiak, it just didn't work out. Bobby Slowik is the third guy I think kind of fits that same mold. Slowik's a little bit different than Clint Kubiak and Shane Waldron. Waldron and Kubiak were with coaches that were ultimately going to be fired. Bobby Slowik's a little bit different, right? Bobby Slowik got CJ Stroud rolling last year. A rookie comes in. Bobby Slowik does a phenomenal job in that first year with this guy. And then in the second year, kind of took a step back, right? Like the offense was not as good. And a lot of people do think that that's partly because of Bobby Slowik, and they blame him almost for that. Although CJ Stroud defended him a little bit, he ultimately ended up getting fired. Now, here's the thing, right? And I truly believe this, and I'll put my opinion out there. You guys can clip this, post it on Twitter. I think there's a good chance that in 5 years, Bobby Slowik is a head coach, while DeMeco Ryans is not. And I also think in 5 years, CJ Stroud might not be as good as what we saw last year, right? I actually think there's a possibility that does happen. Some quarterbacks play a lot better with coaches, especially good coaches. And I think Bobby Slowik's a really, really good coach. I think the fact that the Houston Texans used him as a scapegoat, when in reality, the Houston Texans offensive line was super banged up, right? Their left tackle's out for the year. Their left guard was really, really bad. Or I should say, their starting left guard gets hurt. Their backup was really, really bad. They had to poach guys from other teams' practice squads. They have rookies coming in and trying to replace the starters. The Houston Texans offensive line was banged up. And I almost feel like they utilized Bobby Slowik as the scapegoat. And I think there's a chance that this guy could actually be a really good coordinator, which we obviously saw last year, right? Slowik's name was the hottest name in football last year. And I think the big difference with a guy like Slowik and Ben Johnson is Ben Johnson went to a situation where you have the best offensive line and everyone stayed healthy. You have weapons on the offensive side. Everybody stayed healthy. The Texans, how good are those weapons, right? And we'll find that out over the next couple of years. But for the Raiders, I think Bobby Slowik's another guy I would definitely consider. Those are probably the 4 guys that I think I would absolutely love for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, there's other guys that some people have kind of thrown out there. Doug Peterson, who just got fired. Frank Reich, I think he got fired a couple years ago. He was the former head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. And I think he was with the Panthers as well. I think maybe after the Colts job. Brian Leftwich, Thad Lewis, or a couple other guys. These are just some of the names that, these are coordinators that Pete Carroll has ties to, or they're coordinators that you may be able to kind of bring in, right? Let's switch focus, talk a little bit about the defensive guys. I think the defensive guys are going to be interesting because Robert Saleh was the guy I wanted for the Raiders, man. If we somehow landed Robert Saleh, to me, we would have had arguably a top 3 or 4 defense. Like, one of the interesting things, and I'll go ahead and just kind of throw this out there. One of the interesting things that I feel like I'm starting to notice when it comes to the NFL draft process is it really doesn't matter, right? Like, and what I mean by that is, Dan Quinn came to the Dallas Cowboys and he drafted guys for the Cowboys like Deron Bland. And I think Bland was like a 5th or 6th round pick, and Bland ended up being one of the best corners in the NFL. This past year, Dan Quinn went to the Washington Commanders, and they drafted the corner, I think he was out of Michigan in the 2nd round, Mike something with an S, I don't know what his last name is. And he had a really, really good rookie year as well, right? Really, really solid player. And you look at a guy like Vic Fangio, who's with the Miami Dolphins, really solid defense. The Philadelphia Eagles really, really struggled last year. Vic Fangio comes in this year, and they have arguably the best defensive scheme in the NFL. I almost feel like players in the draft don't matter as much as some people think, right? I almost think the defensive coordinator and the scheme that guys get into matter a whole lot more, right? I think when Robert Saleh goes to the 49ers and he drafts Fred Warner and he brings in guys like Javon Kinlaw and he puts these guys into his scheme and system, and then he goes to the Jets and he kind of does the same exact thing with some of the guys that they've drafted. It's not a coincidence that Robert Saleh has a top 5 defense with the 49ers and a top 5 defense with the Jets. It's not a coincidence that you get guys like Vic Fangio who have a dominant defense, guys like Steve Spagnuolo who have a dominant defense. To me, it's almost not the players, it's the scheme. And don't get me wrong, if you take a guy like Abdul Carter with the top 10 pick, he's going to be better than a defensive end you get in like the 4th round, right? You get a defensive tackle in the 1st round, he's going to be better most likely than the guy in the 4th round. But the thing is Gus Bradley or Pete Carroll can draft a 4th round defensive tackle and they can have the same type of production depending on the scheme, right? And I hope that makes sense. Which was one of the reasons why I really, really wanted the Raiders to bring in Robert Saleh as their defensive coordinator. But of course, Robert Saleh has decided he's going to go back to the 49ers. He has officially taken their job. Really good pickup for the 49ers, right? I think they needed this for their defense. Saleh goes back there, probably be there for about 2 years before he gets another head coaching opportunity. And I think this is a good thing for the 49ers. But another guy that I think the Raiders got to consider, and this is a guy that we've had for now, I think, 3 years. I think this Patrick Graham's been here for 3 years. And Patrick Graham's done a really good job for the Raiders. Now, it's unfortunate because Patrick Graham was a candidate to become a head coach. He interviewed for, I believe it was the Jags head coaching position this year. I think last year was the Seahawks. And he ended up not getting either, right? The Jags went ahead forward with Liam Cohen. And I think at this point, there's maybe one head coaching job left. I think it's the New Orleans Saints. I'm not sure if Patrick Graham's going to end up getting that one. But to me, Patrick Graham's a really good coordinator. And I would love for Patrick Graham to be able to be retained for the Raiders. And he's not under a contract, so Pete Carroll would have to actually bring him back and actually say, we want you. And I say that because I feel like the Raiders defense, not this past year, but the year before in 2023, was really, really, really good under Patrick Graham. Right? It was really, really good, especially in the second half, where we had the number 1 defense in the second half of 2023. And I think if we were healthy in this last season, our defense would have actually been legit as well. And I think with a guy like Pete Carroll at the top, it's a guy that's a defensive-minded guy. You put Patrick Graham and you kind of pair those two guys up. Patrick Graham comes from that Bill Belichick system where they run a lot of match coverages. Pete Carroll's a little bit different, right? Pete Carroll runs a lot of cover 3 looks, and they do a lot of basic stuff up front, or a lot of basic looks, but then they kind of switch it post-snap, right? They do a lot of different things. There's a different type of approach. Graham runs a lot of match concepts. But I think if you put those two guys together and you let those, kind of mix and mesh together, our system and scheme could be a lot better this year as well. And we have good players on the defense side of football. And I would make the argument that with a guy like Pete Carroll, Pete Carroll can see talent, at least in my opinion, he can, right? The Seahawks have always drafted really, really well over the last 6 to 7 years. They've always kind of gotten guys later on in the draft as well that ended up being good football players. To me, I would love for Pete Carroll to bring in a guy like Patrick Graham. Patrick Graham would be my number 1 pick at this point. Now, another guy they might bring in would be a guy like Gus Bradley. Gus Bradley obviously has had past experience with Pete Carroll. He's a guy who, I believe for the first 3 years that Carroll's with the Seahawks, he was the defensive coordinator. And then, of course, he ended up getting a couple of head coaching. I think he had one head coaching role specifically. He went to becoming a defensive coordinator a couple of times. He was with the Raiders, I think, in 2021. And, his scheme wasn't terrible. Obviously, Gus Bradley runs a lot of cover 3, a lot more than a guy like Dan Quinn. Dan Quinn obviously comes from the Pete Carroll system as well, if you guys don't know that. Gus Bradley runs a lot more cover 3, right? He's like 90% cover 3. And it's cover 3 look, right? So what that means is you're going to essentially stack the box. You're going to have a post safety, but they also play a lot of cover 1 man-to-man out of that, right? It's the same look. And they'll just kind of switch it back and forth. But I wouldn't mind Gus Bradley either. I just feel like from a scheme perspective, match coverage is the way to go, right? It just makes it so much harder for a quarterback to read. It just makes it harder versus if you're running cover 3 or a cover 1 look, you put a guy in motion. If the corner runs with them, it's man-to-man defense. It's just too easy to kind of figure out, right? To me, Patrick Graham runs the better scheme. And so we'll see what actually ends up happening. A couple more notable names to kind of keep an eye on. Chris Richard took over as defensive coordinator after Dan Quinn had left, and I think he was coordinator for a couple of years for the Seahawks. Clint Hurt was the most recent defensive coordinator for Pete Carroll, I think 2022 and 2023 before Carroll's ultimately let go. And then, of course, Ken Norton Jr. is another guy the Raiders have had experience with. Ken Norton Jr. was the linebackers coach for Pete Carroll. And then he was the defensive coordinator after Chris Richard had ultimately left, right? So a lot of names that this guy has worked with, a lot of high-end names, guys that are kind of influencing the NFL. We'll see what Pete Carroll ends up doing. I think it's important to get these coordinators right. I want to know what you guys think, man. Are there any guys that I missed? Let me know in the comments below. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.